The scalding tea hit 39-year-old Jasmine Carter's face without warning, the liquid splashing across her cheeks and forehead and soaking into her blazer while she gasped in pain and shock. And the flight attendant stood over her with the empty cup still in her hand and an expression that somehow managed to convey both false apology and unmistakable satisfaction. "Oh my, I'm so sorry. You really should have warned me you were going to move your head like that. Passengers need to be aware of their surroundings when crew members are serving beverages," Vanessa said, her voice loud enough to ensure the entire first-class cabin heard her version of events, the version where this was somehow Jasmine's fault for existing in a space where hot tea could be weaponized against her. Jasmine grabbed napkins with shaking hands, pressing them against her burning face while tears streamed from her eyes, from both the physical pain and the humiliation of being attacked in front of dozens of witnesses who were now staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to sympathy to the uncomfortable avoidance that came from not wanting to get involved in someone else's trauma. She hadn't moved her head suddenly. She'd been sitting perfectly still reviewing case files on her tablet when Vanessa had approached from behind and deliberately tipped the cup so that hot tea poured directly onto Jasmine's face rather than into the cup holder on her tray table. And Jasmine knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't an accident because she'd been watching Vanessa's hostile behavior escalate over the past 20 minutes, ever since Jasmine had politely declined to move to a different seat when Vanessa had suggested that the passenger in the row behind her, a white businessman, might prefer Jasmine's window seat, and perhaps she wouldn't mind switching to accommodate him. Jasmine had explained calmly that she'd specifically selected and paid for a window seat and didn't wish to move, and she'd watched Vanessa's expression shift from false friendliness to cold hostility as the flight attendant realized this black woman wasn't going to comply with a request that never would have been made of a white passenger, wasn't going to make herself smaller and more accommodating to prioritize someone else's comfort over her own. The tea burns were already forming on her skin, angry red marks that would likely scar, and Jasmine felt rage building alongside the pain because she recognized this moment for what it was. Not just an assault, but a reminder that even in 2025, even in first class, even with all her education and achievements and professional credentials, she could still be attacked by someone who'd decided that putting a black woman in her place was more important than professionalism or basic human decency. Vanessa had moved away toward the galley, and Jasmine could hear her talking to another crew member, her voice carrying just enough for surrounding passengers to hear phrases like, "wasn't paying attention," and "some people just don't understand airplane etiquette." And she was already constructing the narrative that would absolve her of responsibility and frame Jasmine as the problem passenger who'd created her own difficulties through carelessness or incompetence. A passenger across the aisle, a white woman in her 50s, leaned over with genuine concern in her voice. "Are you okay? That looked deliberate. She wasn't even trying to pour into your cup. She just dumped it on your face. I saw the whole thing, and I'll gladly provide a witness statement if you need it." Jasmine nodded her thanks while continuing to press cold napkins against her burns. And she pulled out her phone with hands that had finally stopped shaking, not from fear, but from the controlled fury of someone who'd spent 15 years as an attorney at the Federal Aviation Administration and knew exactly what legal violations had just occurred at 30,000 feet. Jasmine placed a call that connected immediately despite the altitude, her voice steady and professional despite the pain radiating from her face. "This is Jasmine Carter, attorney with the FAA's Legal Enforcement Division, identification number 74381. I'm currently on flight 3942 and I need to report an assault by a crew member. A flight attendant named Vanessa deliberately poured hot tea on my face, causing burns and potential scarring. I have multiple witnesses who observed the attack, and I'm requesting that this aircraft's captain be notified immediately that there's an active federal investigation into crew misconduct involving violence against a passenger." She listened for a moment, then added with the precision of someone who'd prosecuted dozens of airline violations, "Yes, I want the flight diverted if necessary. I want the flight data recorder and cabin surveillance footage preserved. I want statements from all crew members and passengers in the surrounding rows, and I want Vanessa detained upon landing, because this wasn't just assault. This was assault by a crew member against a passenger during a commercial flight, which falls under our jurisdiction and carries federal penalties, including potential criminal charges. The cabin had gone silent, every passenger now watching as this development unfolded, and Jasmine saw Vanessa emerge from the galley with an expression that suggested she'd overheard at least part of the conversation and was beginning to realize she'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. The lead flight attendant appeared, a man whose name tag identified him as Thomas and whose face showed he was already aware this situation was about to become a career-defining crisis. "Ma'am, I understand there's been an incident with beverage service. I want to assure you that we take all passenger concerns seriously and will conduct a full investigation." Jasmine looked at him with eyes that were still watering from the tea burns, but that carried the kind of authority that came from years of holding airlines accountable for regulatory violations. "Thomas, let me be very clear about what happened here. I declined to switch seats at your colleague Vanessa's request because I had specifically selected and paid for this window seat. She became hostile and made several comments suggesting I didn't understand airplane etiquette, and then she approached from behind and deliberately poured hot tea on my face rather than into my cup holder, causing burns that are already forming blisters and will likely require medical treatment. This wasn't an accident. This was a retaliatory assault witnessed by multiple passengers. And as an attorney with the FAA's Legal Enforcement Division, I'm informing you that this airline is now facing potential federal enforcement action, civil litigation, and possible criminal charges against Vanessa for assault during a commercial flight." Thomas's face had gone from concerned to pale, and his voice came out strained. "You're an FAA attorney? Miss Carter, I apologize. I didn't realize—" Jasmine cut him off with a look that probably terrified airline executives in countless enforcement hearings. "The fact that you didn't know my profession shouldn't change how you respond to a crew member assaulting a passenger. Every passenger deserves protection from violence regardless of whether they work for the regulatory agency that oversees your industry. The problem isn't that Vanessa attacked an FAA attorney. The problem is that she felt comfortable attacking any passenger. And the fact that your first instinct was to minimize this as a beverage service incident rather than immediately removing her from duty tells me there are systemic problems with how this airline handles crew misconduct." The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologetic but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of a serious incident involving crew misconduct. We will be continuing to our destination where law enforcement and FAA investigators will be waiting to board. The crew member involved has been removed from service for the remainder of the flight, and we apologize for any disruption to your travel." Vanessa was being escorted to the rear galley by Thomas and another crew member, and I heard her protesting loudly. "This is insane. It was an accident. She moved right as I was pouring. I can't be held responsible for passengers who don't sit still. This woman is making a huge deal out of nothing." The passenger who'd offered to provide a witness statement stood up, addressing Thomas directly. "That's a complete lie. I watched the entire interaction from 2 feet away. Your colleague Vanessa approached from behind, positioned the cup over this woman's face rather than near the cup holder, and deliberately poured the tea onto her face while looking directly at what she was doing. It was assault, not an accident, and I'm a registered nurse, so I can also testify about the severity of the burns she inflicted." Several other passengers nodded and volunteered that they'd also witnessed the attack and would provide statements, and Thomas looked increasingly distressed as he realized the evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Jasmine pulled out her tablet, which had been protected from the tea by its case, and she began documenting her injuries with photographs, noting the time, the location, the names of witnesses, and the specific sequence of events, years of legal training kicking in automatically, even as pain throbbed through her burned face. Another crew member approached with a first aid kit and ice packs, her voice genuinely apologetic. "Miss Carter, I'm Sarah. I'm certified in first aid. May I examine your burns and provide treatment?" Jasmine nodded, and as Sarah applied cold compresses and antibiotic ointment, she explained that the burns were second degree in several areas and would definitely require follow-up medical care, possibly including treatment to minimize scarring. When the plane landed, there was indeed a significant delegation waiting. Airport police, FAA investigators from the local field office, airline executives, and paramedics who immediately began treating Jasmine's injuries while investigators photographed the evidence and began interviewing witnesses. Vanessa was escorted off in handcuffs, still protesting that this was all an overreaction, and I heard one of the FAA investigators tell her bluntly, "Ma'am, you assaulted a federal employee during the performance of her duties. You committed that assault on a commercial aircraft, which puts it under federal jurisdiction. You have multiple witnesses against you, including a registered nurse, and you have cabin footage that will show exactly what you did. So I'd strongly suggest you stop talking and request an attorney, because you're facing both federal charges and civil liability that's going to be substantial." The airline's regional vice president approached Jasmine with visible anxiety. "Miss Carter, on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize unreservedly. This behavior is completely unacceptable. Vanessa is being terminated immediately and will be cooperating fully with all investigations and covering all of your medical expenses." Jasmine looked at him with an expression that suggested his apology was noted but insufficient. "What I want is a comprehensive review of how your airline trains crew members to handle conflicts with passengers, because Vanessa's behavior suggests she felt entitled to retaliate against me for not complying with an inappropriate request to give up my seat. That sense of entitlement doesn't develop in isolation. It comes from a culture that either encourages or fails to adequately discourage discriminatory treatment of passengers, particularly passengers of color who are disproportionately asked to accommodate white passengers' preferences. So beyond firing Vanessa and covering my medical bills, I want to see evidence of systemic change in training, oversight, and accountability." What you just witnessed wasn't just about one flight attendant having a bad day or making a careless mistake. It was about how service workers sometimes weaponize their positions to punish customers who don't display the deference or compliance they believe they're entitled to, and how that weaponization disproportionately targets people of color, who are already navigating spaces where their presence is questioned and their boundaries are treated as negotiable. Jasmine Carter was sitting in a seat she'd selected and paid for when Vanessa asked her to move to accommodate a white passenger's preference, and when Jasmine politely declined to give up her seat for no legitimate reason, Vanessa responded by pouring hot tea on her face in an attack that left physical scars alongside the psychological trauma of being assaulted in a public space while dozens of people watched. Think about the calculation Vanessa made in that moment. The decision that this black woman needed to be punished for not being accommodating enough, for not making herself smaller to prioritize a white man's comfort, for having the audacity to assert that her paid seat selection mattered as much as anyone else's preferences. And think about how Vanessa immediately tried to frame the assault as Jasmine's fault for not sitting still or paying attention. How she constructed a narrative of passenger carelessness to cover her own deliberate violence. The devastating irony that Vanessa attacked someone who literally works for the federal agency that regulates airline safety and crew conduct perfectly illustrates how bias operates independently of risk assessment, how people's prejudices override their self-preservation instincts, how the urge to put someone in their place can be so strong that perpetrators don't even consider the potential consequences until those consequences are unavoidable. If this story made you angry, If you felt protective of Jasmine and horrified by the casual cruelty of having hot tea poured on your face as punishment for asserting your rights, channel that anger into examining how often you've witnessed or experienced service workers treating customers with hostility when they don't comply with inappropriate requests. How often you've seen people of color asked to accommodate white preferences in ways that would never be demanded in reverse. How often violence and mistreatment get framed as victims' fault for not being careful or aware enough. Share this video because it illustrates that professional success and legal expertise don't protect people of color from being attacked when they assert boundaries or decline to prioritize others' comfort over their own. They just occasionally provide tools to demand accountability that most victims can't access. Comment below with your own experiences of being asked to give up seats or space to accommodate others, of facing retaliation for asserting your rights, of having service workers weaponize their positions against you when you didn't display sufficient deference. Because documenting these patterns makes it harder for institutions to dismiss them as isolated incidents or accidents. Subscribe if you believe that passengers shouldn't have to work for regulatory agencies to receive protection from crew violence, that seat selection should be respected regardless of who wants to trade, that the next generation deserves to travel without fear that declining unreasonable requests will result in physical assault disguised as beverage service accidents. And most importantly, be the witness who speaks up immediately when you see someone being attacked, who offers detailed statements, who refuses to let perpetrators control the narrative about what happened, because support from bystanders can transform an isolated assault into documented evidence that demands institutional accountability and criminal prosecution. Jasmine will carry facial scars as permanent reminders of Vanessa's attack, but she also has the legal expertise and evidence to ensure that this incident results in both individual consequences and systemic reforms that might protect future passengers from similar violence.